Thank you to everyone who is joining us now live, no matter where you are tuning in from whatever little corner of the world. What we're going to do today is we are going to walk through the HBS application. A lot of it is really straightforward, hooray! But some of it is not so straightforward, and there are little tips and tricks that can help you make the most of your application. Okay, so here we are. We're on the first page. And you're like, okay, Maria, why are we even bothering with the first page? Because the one thing I want to point out on the very first page when you log in is the deadlines. The deadline is due at noon Boston time. This is a really important thing because sometimes at different schools, it might be due at 5 p.m. their local time. It might be due at midnight their local time. So for whatever school you're applying to, when you make note of the deadlines, the deadline is the date is not like the day. It could be at different times for different schools based on their time zones. All right, so on to the personal side of things. Most of this page is pretty straightforward, right? You're going to put your name. You can choose different types of addresses. So if you want, like, say a mailing address, or if you're let's say you're based somewhere for work temporarily for 6 months. This happens. A lot of applicants to HBS have fairly international careers, and so you can add different types of addresses. Which country do you currently reside? These are all very straightforward. So the first kind of tricky, or not tricky, but the first non-straightforward text box that we encounter is geographic background. So as we try to get to know you, it is helpful for us to learn about where you grew up. For many people, maybe that was one place, but for many people, that was more than one place. So please share with us where you spent the majority of your life from birth to age 18. And if you moved around to multiple places, well, tell us about that too. So this box, I measured it last night. It's 250 characters. So you will say which country. This would be presumably the primary country, or the primary country and city where you grew up. If you have to pick, if you're like, but Maria, I really did change countries over and over and over again, or places over and over and over again. I think if I had to pick, I would choose for which one to use in the drop downs. I would pick where you went to high school, because really those high school years tend to be the most formative, right? A lot of us don't really remember. You might say like, oh, but I grew up in Argentina until age 4, and I'm sure it left some sort of indelible mark somewhere deep in your brain, but probably not enough to really influence you the same way that where you spent your adolescence impacted you. So if you have to pick one primary one, here I would pick where you went to high school. Um, and then the additional context box, this is 250 characters. If we assume roughly 5-ish characters per word, that's about 50 words. So here's where you can explain some of those minutiae if you did in fact, I don't know, move around a lot. I think if I were filling this out for myself, I would point out that I spent many of my, even though I grew up in Baltimore, I spent many of my summers in South America visiting my mom's family. So because that was an important, very impactful thing for me growing up. So I think you could put something, if you had significant international, if you went on vacation once to the Caribbean, that does not count. But if you had something that really impacted, your childhood or your adolescence, I would put it here. Email address, telephone numbers, birth date. Hopefully you know your birth date. That is not my birth date. I am significantly older than I was not, in fact, born in 1993. Citizenship information, pretty straightforward. Primary, dual if you've got more than one. It's asking me for a social security number because I'm a US citizen. Gender, female, male, non-binary. What is your gender identity? Whatever it is you want to put, LGBTQIA. Someone once asked me, like, what should I put for the LGBTQ box in these application forms? And I'm like, whatever you're comfortable sharing, right? Like I think sometimes people get too much in their heads about, I need to game the system. And don't try to game the system, just tell the truth. Or if this is a particular question where you're not comfortable with the truth, then don't tell the truth, but at least just put whatever you would comfortably identify yourself as in public. For the different languages, if you are fluent in languages other than English, you can put them here. It's a huge drop down list. And then there's, on the proficiency, you can have some instruction, which basically means I can say hello and the time of day. Conversational, I can do well enough where someone might not, it won't be flawless, but I can at least kind of go back and forth with a few lines of dialogue with another human being. And then fluent. Be very careful about what you put here, because especially if you put fluent in another language other than English. Now, obviously, if you are from the Ukraine and you put that you're fluent in Ukrainian, okay, well, that one's pretty obvious. I'm not going to question it. But if you're from, let's say, Ireland, and you put that you're fluent in, say, French, it is not unheard of. At least it's not unheard of because it happened to me. So in my interview, I put fluent in. I'm sorry, in my application, I put fluent in Spanish, and in my interview, my interviewer in the middle, without any warning, just burst. Just the next question, the next couple questions were in Spanish, just to test to see if I was telling the truth, and I was. But don't put something here if it is not the truth. All
Maria,
right,
quick
let me.
question. What happens if
Yeah.
I speak a second language but it's not in that list?
Then I guess as a backup, you could put it into the resume, but it's a pretty comprehensive list. All right, moving on. The next section is family. Um, so you are able to put one or two different parents or guardians, or also other adult people, any adult that were involved in raising you. I do think it's a little, and this is not just Harvard specific, but a lot of schools only let you put two, which is a little bit odd for people who might have had, like, I don't know, maybe I'm a child of the late 70s and 80s. Like, everyone was getting divorced when I was growing up, so everyone had two sets of parents. But I guess what they're looking for is either like your primary biological parents, if you're from, if that is your situation, or if not, then who were the two main people who raised you. Note that this might be a grandparent, or this might be a foster parent, or an adoptive parent. The good news is they give you a box. We'll get to that box in a second, where you can explain a little bit more of what's going on here. But so in this case, they want to know basically first name, last name, and then what's the highest level of formal education that the parent completed. So note that this is not like they have a CPA or they have a real estate license. This is like a formal, is it a bachelor's degree? Is it a master's degree? It might be unknown if you never met this parent. I prefer not to share this information. I'm not sure why anyone would. That seems, I don't know. No schooling completed or primary school, right? If they did not go to college, that's what you would select. Um, and then what do they do? Where do they work? What's their industry? And then they ask the same information for the second parent, if you want to include a second parent. Siblings, just the ages of your siblings. This kind of gives me a sense of, um, what's the kind of the household that you grew up in. So then I always, whenever I see this box, I always sort of mentally look at, I'm like, okay, what year is it again? Oh, right, we're in 2024 now. Okay, right. And then this person was born when, and that means that they're 26. And then it just knowing how many siblings you have and what ages they are kind of gives me a very rough sense of, were you the baby in the family? Were you the oldest? Are you the only child, etc. Are you a first generation college student? This is if none of your parents, like neither one of them or anyone who helped raise you, graduated from a 4-year college or university. Then select yes. And then here, as I promised, down here at the bottom, we've got the 250 characters, again, roughly 50 words, to share. This is where you explain, the background of, well, really, my grandmother raised me because my mother was either traveling or perhaps incarcerated, or perhaps, she just wasn't a very good mother, whatever it is. Here's where you can explain your family background. Now, notice that they have here the word optional. Optional means optional. Just because you see an empty box on an application form does not mean that you have to fill it out. I might have a pretty good sense of your background if you're like, I grew up in Cleveland and my parents live in Cleveland and my dad's a dentist and my mom's also a dentist. I, I probably don't need a whole lot else of more information beyond that. Clearly, since this is underneath the question, are you a first generation college student? For me, the spirit in which this family background question is being asked is more, did you have anything either very uncommon in your upbringing, or were there any particular obstacles that you faced in your upbringing? So, in sum and in conclusion, if you're like, just sort of take a step back and say, okay, well, if I tell them, like, they know where I grew up until age 18, they know what my parents do, what their deal is, at least at a very high level. For many people, that is enough. All right. So moving on to the resume. Okay. Ideally, this would be 1 to 2 pages in length. When they say 1 to 2 pages in length, they don't. 2 is really not. It's acceptable, but it's not great. So even though they say they're okay with 2 pages, really pretty much everyone applying to business school should aim for a 1 page resume. Not only because these admissions readers don't have a lot of time, but also because just about anyone can fit their resume onto 1 page if they try hard enough. And if you really have so much experience that there's no possible way it can fit into one, it's impossible, Maria, then you might be too old for the HBS MBA, to be very honest with you. So then you should be looking at part-time programs or other programs, but maybe not the full-time program at HBS. So make the resume 1 page. They say they're okay with 2. It's a trap. It's not a trap. They're not going to like reject you if you submit a 2 page resume, but it's also not great. Also, because they're keeping in mind, if you joined my essay session last week, if we think about the fact that admissions readers have different stakeholders, when they are reading your file, in the back of their mind, they are thinking about the other people that they are beholden to on some level for how are these other people going to think about your candidacy. And one of those other stakeholders is employers. So if right now your resume is there's no possible way to get it under 1 page, well, you're going to need to get it under 1 page eventually because if you enroll in business school, you're going to need a 1 page resume for employers. At least employers would prefer it. So just a heads up there. Do not be do not be fooled into complacency by the it can be 2 pages. I don't know. So that's going to be a PDF document. Oops. I don't want to upload a PDF document right now. So, how many months of post college full time work experience will you have upon enrolling in August of 2025? This one might take a few seconds of counting on your fingers, but hopefully is not too taxing of a request. Do you have any gaps in your employment history? Now, what's interesting about this is that a lot of schools will say, for example, we define a gap as 3 months without employment or 6 months without employment. Here they just say, "Do you have any gaps?" So I would use 3 months as sort of the cutoff. If you were unemployed, but it was for 2 months, yeah, maybe you don't really have to. I don't know. I wish they would be a little bit more specific here. But normally it's if it's more than a couple of months, then you do have to explain it. This could happen, for example, if you were laid off and it took you a little bit of time to find a new job. This could happen sometimes you were between jobs. Maybe, you had another job that was lined up and they said, "You know what? We really don't need you until October." And you said, "Hooray, I'm going to Europe I'm going to go travel," or whatever it is that you did. So for the explanation, here you get 1,000 characters. So they really do give you a pretty generous, that's 4 times as big as the normal text boxes in this application form. So here's where you can really explain what you were doing with that time. Um, Note that you need to tread lightly here. For example, if you were unemployed because let's say you quit in a huff, you had this boss from that was just the worst boss ever, and you're like, "I'm out of here." Um, you're going to have to tread very lightly and very delicately with that story because, again, when I think about who I'm beholden to as an admissions reader, I don't I don't know that I wanna let someone into my class who is very tempestuous and can't control their who makes rash decisions, and things like that. So if you did quit and leave on bad terms, you are gonna have to think about how you position that. But for the most part, what I would focus on here is not so much why there was a gap in your employment history, but more what you did during that time. So HBS, they have changed the language this year, and I'm a little disappointed because for over 20 years, easily, one of the big things HBS said they looked for, and this was the primary differentiator of who gets into HBS versus other schools, is they're looking for people who have a habit of leadership. And so a habit of leadership, I loved the word habit because a habit is something that we almost do without thinking. And why that word is so powerful is because they're looking for people who are just like they almost can't help it. Like they're just leaders, right? Like like I'm sitting at home and yes, I know I'm unemployed and yes, I lost my job, but am I gonna just watch TV? Like, no, maybe for 2 days I'll feel sorry for myself, but then after that, like, okay, what was I doing? I started taking a Coursera course. I started volunteering at the local food pantry. I started, mentoring younger people, spending that time mentoring younger people to help them do better in their career, whatever it was that you did with that time. That's what I would focus the bulk of this 1,000 characters on, as opposed to like, well, Renee in accounting was a real monster and she got me fired. And that, like, nah, don't go into that. Just put the positive spin on it. And what did you do with that time? Maybe you even learned a little something, right? Maybe that time off was actually good for you because it helped you develop a skill that has now helped you out in your life. Okay, so for the employment instructions, HBS is different from a lot of schools in that they only let you put in 3 employers. 3 employers. Now, in the past, they were pretty strict that if you had been at one employer, say for several years, and it had several roles within that employer, they're like, nope, just list it once. And now, like a couple years, maybe 4 years ago, they started softening a little where they're like, okay, fine, you can list the same employer twice if you've had very different work. So I would, for example, let's say you started off in engineering and then you moved over to marketing, that I would, because those 2 roles are so different, maybe I would consider making that 2 separate entries. But don't panic. Again, that's what the resume is for. The resume is going to tell a lot of your story. And then whatever doesn't get told between the resume and these little text boxes here, that's what the essays are for. So, the noteworthy things here, please put your stuff in US dollars. I once had someone reach out to me in a panic because they had put their stuff in rupees, in Indian rupees. And so it made it seem like they were, I don't know, like millionaires. And I'm like, oh. Um, so just, these are the sorts of things where right now you're like, wow, Maria, thanks for adding value. I'm so glad I got up early to watch this. It's early for me at least. But this is the sort of thing where, like, if you don't calculate this in advance and you wait until 11:55 a.m. on September 4th Boston time to start filling this out, you might be like, oh my gosh, what is my annual salary and bonus in US dollar? Like, like if you have to convert it, or maybe even if you're in the US, you might have to, like, oh man, let me pull up my pay stub. I don't remember what is my salary and stuff. So they have all these like things here about like, don't include this, do include this. Um, And then this is where I like how here they're like, you don't need to think about this now, but just so you know, if you get in, we are going to try to verify as much of this information as we possibly can. So again, do not lie. Um, so this part of the application form for some other schools is going to be a pretty straightforward thing. For HBS, I really want you to be thoughtful about what you put here. So first, your employer, this is going to be a searchable drop down. If your employer is not listed, then you enter in whatever they are called. Now, for division unit office group, this one is, let me see, did I figure out how many it is? This one had a pretty long, look how there's quite a bit of room here, right? If you can see, I put a ton of like just dummy text. Um, so what I would put here is make sure that when I read after division unit office group, that I as a reader understand exactly where in this company you sit. So if you're at a very big company, like say Alphabet Google, don't just say up here like I work at Alphabet. Uh, where? Do you work in Maps? Do you work in AdWords? Do you work in Gmail? Do you work in, and within Gmail, do you work in finance? Do you work in marketing? Do you work in product? Do you work, right? So here is where you're going to explain, all right, up here's my big employer, but here is where you're going to explain which division, and then also within that division, you could even say function. So I work in operations for Amazon for their B2B warehousing services, whatever. Um, Industry, you're going to pull down annual revenue, number of employees, website, phone number. This is all pretty standard. The workplace location. So even if your company's headquartered somewhere else, if you are in the office in Paris, you're going to put Paris. Is this your current employer? If it isn't, you'll put the start date and end date. If it is your current employer, this is a relatively new one. They have primary employer. And this is interesting because this is sort of a nod to more and more folks of you young people's generation. A lot of you have these side gigs. For some of you, the side gig is nothing more than a hobby that generates a couple of dollars here and there. I would not consider putting that in employment. But if you really do have 2 substantial jobs that you're doing, the primary employer would be the one where you get most of the paycheck, or where you want them to put most of their attention when they are reading your your file. You might consider putting a side gig as your employer here if that side gig is very related to your career vision. So let's say you work at Amazon in their warehousing division, but on the side you have been purchasing apartments. You've become a small scale real estate investor and you want to go to business school to become a full-time real estate investor. Then maybe you would put your side gig here of like, oh yeah, I flip apartments or something. Um, it might not be an employer per se, but it could be a way to really emphasize, like, look, I've been doing this for 4 years and I really understand it, et cetera, et cetera. Note that this is not the only place you could do it. Of course, the resume is going to do a ton of your heavy lifting. So again, title, function, the type of employment, full time, part time, internship, and then you're going to sort of show um, if it's not your current employer, no. Then down here, it should eventually do repeat your current most recent role. Okay. So it'll tell you, it gives you a chance to give me this current or more recent role, title, function, annualized salary. First or initial role, title, function, annualized salary. This helps you show that growth, right? So if you have been at a company for a couple of years, maybe you haven't gotten a promotion per se, but if you've gotten some sort of a promotion, that's great. Please put that. But also if your compensation has gone up, because money talks. And so if your employer has been valuing you, this is certainly not as important as people think it is, but it is nice to see if you started at one salary 2 years ago and they have bumped you up. That's just a nice little signal of faith that this employer really, really likes you. Okay, so employer description, again, is just going to be a longer version of that division unit thing that we were talking about before. These 4 boxes here, especially key accomplishments and most significant challenge, this is going to be a lot more work than what you would put for other schools. And it's interesting because inside of my product, Applicant Lab, which is the product that I developed based on my 20 years of giving admissions advice, I actually break out like an entire video on what to put in these boxes. But I don't do that for other schools. And sometimes people are like, "Hey, Maria, like why do you only do it for HBS?" Because for HBS it's so much more important than it is for other schools. And we'll talk about that in a second. Um, but this is really, especially these key accomplishments and most significant challenges. You get 250 characters for each one of these 4 boxes. Please be very strategic in what you put here. First of all, the thing you should not do is copy and paste your resume, right? Definitely do not do that. What you're going to do is you want to really explain, especially within accomplishments and challenge, you really want to highlight for me and tell me in a conversational tone what are the things you want me to focus on when I'm analyzing and assessing your candidacy. One big tip I will give you right now is do not make your accomplishments or your biggest challenge technical or intellectual in nature. If your biggest challenge was I had to rebuild a database because we were doing a cloud migration, don't put that because I'm not hiring you for that job. The biggest challenges and the biggest accomplishments should always be based on your EQ, where you're showing that you have that leadership potential that will be applicable regardless of which industry or field you end up going into. So just keep that in mind. Do not make it a technical challenge, make it an interpersonal challenge. By that I mean we did the cloud migration and all the people who had been at the company for 40 years did not want to use the new interface. They were like, the old interface worked just fine and I don't want to use the new interface. So how did you overcome that? Well, I led some training sessions and I bought them all pizza and I said, hey, here's how we're going to do it. It's going to be great. Whatever it is that you did, keep in mind that it should be interpersonal. So you do that for all of your employers. So this is really important because what's going to happen is that your resume is your list of greatest hits. The key accomplishments and most significant challenge kind of are a preview, like a teaser, like the teaser trailer of the movie, right? Of like, okay, here's some of the coolest things I did. And then in the essays is where you can really go into more detail a couple of different of these accomplishments. So the post MBA goals, typical sort of drop down, whatever it is you want to do, industry, function, etc. Now, briefly, tell us more about your career aspirations. 500 characters remaining. In the past, the HBS essay was an open-ended essay. 900 words, whatever you want, your choice. You would never have to talk about your career goals in your MBA essay because you had these 500 characters to explain your career aspirations. And so I was like, well, great. We got these 500 characters, so you don't have to talk about your aspirations. What's a little bit weird is that now I'm just going to jump ahead to the essays. Here they want to hear a little bit more about the background, what has influenced your aspirations and the impact you want to make. What you can do though is if we think strategically about the fact that the aspirations, we get a 500 character box for the post MBA goals, you do not need to repeat what those aspirations are in the business minded essay. I'm already going to know. I'm going to know it from this little box here. If this little box, I think, pretty much gets its own page in the application form when the PDF gets printed out, right? It is paid attention to. So you don't need to worry about like, oh, should I repeat what my goals are here? This essay is more about the influence of those goals, like what has created, like where did it even come from, and not so much, well, what is the goal itself? So you have to be strategic. Similarly, and just yeah, because I know we are running out of time, but the good news is that we're at, the rest of the stuff is pretty straightforward. Um, Similarly for the essays, let's say you already for essay 2 where it says how you invest in others. Don't You need to think very strategically about what is in the rest of the application form first. Fill out the rest of the application form as strongly as you can first, and then whatever has not already been covered, then talk about that in the essay. So for example, how you invest in others for the second essay, just out of a just to pick one, if your activities, just jumping to that section, let's say you have some sort of, you've worked at a homeless shelter, you volunteered at a homeless shelter, realize that you can put 200 characters of description of the work you've done at that homeless shelter. You can really use it to tell some of your story, for example. So let's say I volunteered at a homeless shelter. Well, why? I experienced homelessness as a child, and then I overcame the board member's objection, blah, blah, blah. So if I'm writing essay 2 about the work I did with that homeless shelter, I don't then have to repeat any of the information that is already in the activity section. So speaking of the activity section, even though you only get 200 characters to describe what you did, you can always these boxes up here for activity and your role are pretty open. So for example, if you've had multiple roles within a volunteer organization or community organization, you can put multiple things here. Or for example, if it's something famous like the Red Cross, you don't need to explain it. But if it's something not so famous like say the House of Ruth, then here you would put in parentheses, you know, it's my city's largest homeless shelter or whatever it might be. So you can provide additional context in that box, even though it doesn't explicitly ask you to. That's a way to maximize the space that you've been given. For awards and recognition, the key thing here, don't be obnoxious here, by the way. Just because you can put more text here doesn't mean you necessarily should. But the good news is that for the basis of selection 200 character limit, you can that's not a whole lot. So you can always put a little bit more information up here. So let's say the award that I won was the Daffy Duck Shake Your Tail Feather Award. And then here you could put something like given to 3 out of, I don't know, have 400,000 contestants, so you can provide some of the information about that award. Let's say a common one is people get scholarships, and it's a very famous scholarship in their university or a very famous award. So, for example, where I went to college, it's called the Pine Prize is the #1 award you can get. If you didn't go to Princeton, you're not going to know that, right? So here's where you would put like the name of the prize and then parentheses, the highest honor given to any undergraduate. Note, I did not win the Pine Prize, but if I had, I would put in parentheses, it's the highest award given to whatever. And then down here, the most important thing here for the basis of selection is give me context. So I need to know like percentages, numbers, etc. Because again, I'm not going to know this award from wherever it is that you went to college, right? So say to me like, yeah, there were 300 other teams on that hackathon. My idea was chosen out of 4,000 entries or something like that. And it was chosen based on blah, blah, blah. Now, if there were several bases of selection, like let's say you won an award in undergrad for like the all around best student, we love you award. Maybe you want it because of academic excellence and also due to community service and also for other reasons. Here in these 200 characters, again, emphasize more those interpersonal reasons you want it and not so much, well, because here's my GPA and here were my grades and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, moving on to the essays. So the essays, it used to be one big essay for like a decade. Now they've broken it down into 3 essays. We're going to do a separate section on essays later. The biggest difference, not only is the biggest difference that now it's 3 instead of 1, and I do not like these. Whatever. We'll see what happens. I think they're going to change next year because I think the answers they're going to get to these essays are very unsatisfying. But we'll see what happens. Another difference, though, is that you used to be able to upload a PDF, and now you have to type it in directly. And the problem with that, why I think that's suboptimal, is that I can now not put italics or bold, or you know what I mean? Like, you used to be able to use formatting to really emphasize a point. Now I guess I would do something like this. I would put like maybe you could do like what is it, that underline? Something like that to convey that you're trying to underline. It's just not optimal. And then from here on in, this is going to be pretty much the same as everyone else. You're going to upload your test scores. Note that some schools will say, upload all of your test scores. And some schools will say, upload only your best test score, or whatever it might be. One wrinkle that HBS, this is new. If you have taken the GMAT Focus Edition, and if you have not taken the TOEFL or the IELTS, I don't know much about the English test, to be honest. Let's say you went to college in an English-speaking, a university that was taught in English, and therefore you did not have to do a writing assessment as part of, say, the TOEFL, and you took the GMAT Focus Edition, and you don't have an analytical writing assessment score from, let's say, a previous version of the GMAT, you might have to take this additional writing assessment. It's done through GMAT. It's only if you're invited to interview. It's only going to be $30, and I think it's only like a 30-minute writing assessment. It's no big deal. If you're good enough to make it to the interview stage at HBS, you're good enough for this essay to be a piece of cake, this writing assessment to be a piece of cake. But just a heads up, little logistical note. But don't worry about it, because 80% of people don't get invited to interviews, so don't worry about that. The scores must be valid. They must be within 5 years. That's pretty standard. Most schools say that. The recommendations, this is literally the same as every school. Note that if you are applying for a joint degree program, you will be given, for the most part, almost all of them ask you for a 400-word, like, explain how do you expect the joint degree to benefit you. The only one that's a little bit different is if you're applying to the MS MBA in engineering. That one does have more of an entrepreneurial bent, so you will be asked to talk a little bit about your entrepreneurial experiences. So this one's a little bit harder, but understandably so, because this one's really, really more popular. I do not advise most people apply to dual degrees, as a side note. I think that they are not always, if you're young, then go for it, but they are not necessarily the best use of time always, at least not for everyone. So have you previously applied? Information there, and then if you have applied in the past, you get a 250-word limit to talk about how you have grown since your previous application. If you only applied a year or two ago, this should be pretty straightforward, right? In the past 2 years, I got put in charge of an even bigger team, and now I'm doing even cooler stuff. If you applied at 2+2, though, that is the thing. If you're a college senior and you apply then, please don't use the space to say like, well, since I last applied, I graduated from college, and then I went to work at Cisco, and then I did this, because I'm going to know all that from your resume already. So just use your best judgment here. If you applied in 2+2 and now you're applying now, you can just say like, I've had 4 years of experience and it's been great, and hopefully the rest of my application is letting you know that. So yeah, everything. I think the only other final thing to note is that you can apply for a fee waiver. So the cost is $250 to apply, but if you make under a certain threshold of money, you can apply for a fee waiver. However, you do need to apply for this fee waiver. I believe the deadline is 2 weeks before the actual deadline. So if you are planning on getting one of these fee waivers, submit that as soon as you can, that request for the fee waiver as soon as you can. All right, I'm going to pause for just a second. Are there any questions that I am not seeing because I cannot see the chat?
I guess I could
Okay.
start off with just one or two.
Yeah, let's just do one,
And
or let's
then
just do like one or two, and then
we'll ask the top 2 questions of those right now. And so I'll show it on the stage as well. And so the first question that people have is, HBS has only 2 rounds. Are there any disadvantages for round 2?
So there are no official disadvantages for round two. However, realize that HBS, like every business school, they are not unique in this at all. They don't have, quotas, of course not, but they have a rough idea of the buckets of people they want to let in, right? So they have a rough idea of like, okay, here's how many management consultants we want to let in. Here's how many people from banking we want to let in, right? Because if they just simply went by quote unquote most qualified, at least on paper, it would be pretty much everyone who applied. They would just split the class down the middle between McKinsey and Goldman Sachs, and no one, no one from any other company or any other, background would ever get in. So that's not great. So they have sort of a sense of like, all right, well, we're gonna want, a certain percentage from the tech industry, and within tech, we're gonna want some oil and gas people, we're gonna want some manufacturing people, we're gonna want some automotive people. They don't go into it again with numbers, like solid numbers, but there is sort of a sense of, admissions officers call it crafting the class. So if all else is equal, you are better off applying in round one because for all if you are a product manager at a high growth unicorn, guess what? There's maybe 200 other people in the applicant pool, frankly, or maybe more, hundreds of other people who are also product managers at high growth unicorn companies. So to the extent that they might, if they're sort of have a rough idea of like, okay, we're going to want at least one of these folks in each section, so we need at least 9 of them. Um, that spot might be taken if you wait to apply in round two. So the more overrepresented of a group you're from, the people who are the early birds tend to apply in round one. It tends to be the management consultants, the people from finance, and then also increasingly people from engineering backgrounds. Um, so it's better for you to apply in round one if you can. Now, there's a caveat with that because admissions officers also say, and these aren't just empty words, it's actually really smart. Apply when your strongest application will be possible. So let's say you took the GMAT once, you just took it last week and it wasn't a very good score, and you know you can do better. You know in your belly, deep in your tummy, that you can do better. But oh my gosh, not today. I'm going to need like 2 months. If you know for a fact that you're going to get a higher score, definitely apply, save for round two and apply with a higher score versus applying in round one with a very bad score. Or conversely, another good example of when someone might want to think about pushing to round two. Let's say you're working on this huge project and it's been years in the making and it's going to launch in November. Right? So let's keep the product manager example. Let's say you're a product manager, you've been working behind the scenes on this new thing and it's launching in November. And you know that then if you submit in January, early January, you'll then have like say 6 weeks of customer data to really say like it launched and it got covered in this magazine, and Gamers Monthly magazine gave it a 10 out of 10 best game of the year or whatever it was that you're doing. Then you might want to wait because that's more powerful to say, I created a game that launched and was named best game of the year, as opposed to I am currently working on a game that I think is going to be really cool. Right? It's fine if you're right on the cusp. It's fine to say that if you are working on something big, you can say what you can say then in, for example, in the resumes, you could say expected to be, we anticipate that this product will generate $3 million per quarter upon launch. You can put what the expectations are for the product, but it's a little bit better if it's actually concrete. But aside from that, do try to apply earlier rather than later. Now, if you are from one of the aforementioned overrepresented groups, e.g., management consultants, and you apply in round one, there is a good chance that you will get waitlisted until round two, because at that point, I might be saying, well, you look great, but I wonder who I'm going to get in that round two pool. So, but I'd rather have you apply in round one and get waitlisted to round two than apply in round two and then maybe someone just like you, like, oh man, we gave away that spot to someone in round one.
Uh, Fuad Salah asks, what are your thoughts on the GMAT score required for HBS, especially with the GMAT Focus Edition being new?
Um, they're required for HBS. I'm not sure exactly if your question is like, what's the minimum score? Well, technically there is no minimum score. However, what I would go on in the past is based on percentiles. So in the past, the average score was a 730. under the old system, which I think is like 96th percentile or something. Obviously, if you're from an overrepresented group, you're going to want to aim for a higher than average score, and or also if you have low grades from college that you need to overcompensate for, you're going to want to aim for a higher than average score. Um, but so I would look at, because I would just look at percentiles. So for the new GMAT, aim for 96th percentile if you're a standard candidate. If you're for overrepresented, aim for 99th percentile. It is only one data point, but I would go by percentiles.
Sounds great. All right. Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. There's, of course, more information with Maria in the applicant lab. And then hope to see you guys in a future session. Great. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye. Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Bye.